If you have your Bibles with you, let's turn to Mark's Gospel in the 15th chapter. And again, we want to look at verses 24 through verse 32, and then we'll pick up the story again in verse number 39. Mark chapter 15, verse 24 down to verse 32, and then again in verse number 39. What an exciting day it is. It's a time of year that we always look forward to. It's exciting for us. We kind of get into all the stuff that goes on with Easter. And my prayer this morning is that sometimes when we get involved with all of that stuff, we kind of miss out that the day in front of us is an opportunity to exalt, to glorify, and to magnify Christ, the only reason for gathering, right? The only reason for life itself. We meet this morning in the tradition of the saints who have done it every Sunday morning for thousands of years to celebrate that we serve a risen Savior. On Resurrection Sunday every year, I always think about that early New Testament church going through all that great persecution and how when they'd gather together, they would say to one another, "He is risen," and they would know the other person is a believer if they responded back, "He is risen indeed." Right? That's how they would communicate with one another. And I think of all of our partners across the globe this morning that meet in persecuted areas who follow some of that same tradition today. They got up early this morning and gathered together in darkness and secrecy to declare together in unity that Jesus Christ is risen indeed. Today we don't gather together as a memorial service over the dead, but rather we come and celebrate together that we serve a risen Savior. I always think back to our first trip to India and our opportunity to go to Mahatma Gandhi's memorial where he was martyred, where he was killed, murdered. And one of the things that always sticks out there is that they have this painting. And in that painting they have Muhammad, the prophet of Islam. They have Buddha. They have Jesus Christ. And they're all there pictured in this painting. And above the painting are the words, a prayer from Mahatma Gandhi when he said, "I ask the people of faith to pray that the light might come to India." And I remember one of my pastor friends said, "We are the answered prayer of Mahatma Gandhi," even when he didn't know what he was praying for, because we have brought the light. And then he pointed to that painting and he said, "You know, the only difference is that all of those other people are dead except Jesus was not in the tomb anymore. He's alive and well." We gather together today and we celebrate that, and it brings some hope, some energy into our midst, doesn't it? It's just something about that Easter morning when we gather together, and especially when the sun is shining, it gives us some hope, some extra energy to remember that Jesus Christ is risen from the dead. The reality, however, is that every morning is Easter morning, right? Every time we get up, for those of us who have been purchased by Christ, trusted in Christ through faith, for the forgiveness that is given through His death on the cross of Calvary, for us, every day is Easter morning. We get the opportunity to get up, to live life, and to have breath, and to know that we have a hope beyond the grave because Jesus is risen. Most of the time on an Easter Sunday, we spend our moments in the Scriptures talking about what happened after the cross, right? We spend our few moments talking about those Marys who gathered together and they came to pay their last respects, as it were, to Jesus as He had died and had been buried in that borrowed tomb of Joseph Arimathea. And we gather together and we talk about those things. But this morning, what I want to do is something a little bit different. And I want to look back at the events that transpired before the resurrection, because I believe we can't have a full understanding of the gravity of Easter morning until we see, even if it's difficult for us to do so, until we see what the gruesomeness of the cross was and the different reactions to it. In fact, I want to highlight 4 individuals this morning and their reactions to what happened at the cross of Christ. Now, doing so means that we have to look at something that's pretty difficult to look at. We have to look at something that was grotesque, that was painful, that was difficult even for those gathered on that day. But I think it's important to do so because in every life, there are moments of excitement, of exhilaration, of triumph, like an Easter morning. But just like before Easter had to come the cross, there are also those moments in life where there's great difficulty, pain, sorrow, and sadness. In fact, I know this morning, pastoring here for 10 years, that there's probably folks within the sound of my voice, folks in our congregation this morning, that may be going through one of those difficulties right now. And there's that old phrase that the preacher would say, I know it's Friday, but Sundays are coming, right? And sometimes in our churches we forget that pain and sorrow are a part of life. In fact, the Apostle Paul wrote to the Philippians his entire letter based on this reality, that you and I must suffer as Christ suffered before we gain the crown that he gained. That is, that before we get the crown of life, we must also take the crown of thorns. And if we are to rightly understand Easter Sunday morning, we first have to understand all of the pain that led up to it. And I believe in that. It's great hope for you and I this morning that no matter what difficulty, no matter what calamity, no matter what trouble and trial may be in our life this morning, that there is a great hope because Jesus rose from the dead, that we'll survive this, right? And that even if we didn't, it's okay because we have eternity to sing the praises of Christ together. As has already been said, we don't gather together this morning to memorialize the dead or those who have passed on before us, even though they're fresh on our minds today. But rather, we gather together today because we, of all people in all the earth, have the only hope of eternal life because of the only Savior, Jesus Christ. Before the resurrection stood a moment in history. A moment which has been memorialized for thousands of years, known in Christendom as Good Friday. What's interesting about that expression of Good Friday, and the church aptly named it such with its irony, is because if you were there on that Friday, on that day so many, many years ago, nothing would have looked good at all. After all, on that day in history, the darkest of human sin was placed and put on display in the execution of an innocent sovereign. But what made it so good that day was what was accomplished so many years ago. This morning, I like how the Gospels highlight individuals because they remind us that God does not merely see the masses, but rather He sees our individuality. He sees us where we sit today. We live in a world that paints success as found in the masses. Did you have 5,000 at church on a Sunday morning? And we paint this world as though only thing that matters is when you have a big crowd. What I love about the gospel writers is they show us that Jesus saw past the crowds, past the masses, and He saw into individual lives. And over again, the gospel writers give us accounts of those individuals. And I want to look at some of them this morning. We could lose sight of them in the midst of the crowd that day as we look at the events of the cross. But Mark doesn't allow us to because he tells us what they were thinking, what their testimony was, what they were saying, what they felt about what was transpiring. And it gives us hope this morning because God sees us exactly where we are as well. Mark chapter 15, beginning in verse 24, it says, "And they crucified him and they divided his garments among them, casting lots for them to decide what each should take." It says next in verse number 25, "And it was the third hour when they crucified him." And it says in verse 26, "And the inscription of the charge against him read, 'The King of the Jews.' And with him they crucified two robbers." Those are our first individuals we'll see, although we'll not look at them in that order. It says, "And with him they crucified two robbers, one on his right and one on his left. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, 'Aha, you who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross.'" Verse 31. "So also the chief priests and the scribes mocked him to one another, saying, 'He saved others, yet he cannot save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross that we may see and believe.'" The events unfold. He's crucified. And he nears unto his death and even dies. And one of the gospel writers tells us some of the things that he said. Mark only tells us that he said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And we come to verse 39, and at the end of that, it says, "And when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, 'Truly this man was the Son of God.'" Today we would change what the centurion said to, "And truly this man is the Son of God," in the present tense. First people I want you to encounter this morning are found in verse number 29. It is so interesting to me that they are unnamed, and I think the reason that they are unnamed is because they could have literally been anybody. They could have been businessmen. They could have been traveling salesmen. They could have been vacationers, lake goers, those who came to pay homage, as it were, to the Passover. We don't know anything about these people. We don't know their backstory. We don't know anything about them. And as such, they stand as a stark reminder that they could be anybody. They could be the people we work with. They could be the people that we live with. They could be anybody and everybody. We know nothing about them. All we are told about them is they were those who passed by. It's written as though they just happened to come across the scene that day. Can you imagine? Coming to Jerusalem for the purpose of partaking in the Passover and celebrating, or maybe they came to see the crowds gathered together. Maybe they wanted to be a part of the energy that was in the room. We know nothing about their reasons for being there, but Mark writes it as though they just showed up on the scene and they just happened to be walking by. And suddenly they looked up and saw in that moment that something greater than themselves was taking place, even though they didn't recognize it, that there was a crucifixion happening in their presence. They're passing by in that moment, and what strikes me is that apparently what they saw didn't even faze them. I told the early church this morning, I remember when my fiance, now beautiful bride, and I went to watch The Passion of the Christ so many years ago in the movie theaters, and we were just kind of overcome by how packed the theater was and how quiet it was and how you could have heard a pin drop in the midst of the entire movie. And we got to the end of it and we were leaving, and Miss Kelly said something along the lines of, "Do you think this is something that we could bring other people to?" And I said, "I don't know if my soul could take that much violence." And yet the reality is that what we saw on a movie screen in a movie paled in comparison to the gruesomeness of the actual crucifixion. And yet these men and women, whoever they are, as they're passing by, whatever they saw did not even shock their conscience. It did not even draw them to a place of scratching their heads. It did not even faze them in the least. In fact, their condemnation over his condition begins to show as they are apparently somewhat familiar with his story. But they're unmoved with concern with what is playing out in front of them. Instead, they join in with the others and they say, "Aha! You who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." I don't know whether they knew that Jesus had made that statement before. Perhaps they had been those who had heard him speak in the past, or perhaps they had heard somebody else say it and they decided to join in with the crowd. Their intention is informed to us by Mark. Essentially, they were not merely quoting back to Jesus' words, for indeed he had promised to destroy that temple and re-raise it, speaking of his own body. But Mark is showing us that they in that moment joined the crowd in the derision. They wanted to mock him. They wanted to make fun of him. He says that they wagged their heads at him. What in the world does that mean? The pastor wags his head every Sunday. That couldn't possibly be a bad thing, right? Well, it's almost Shakespearean of Romeo and Juliet that opens up with Samson saying, "Do you bite your thumb at me, sir?" And he says, "I do bite my thumb, but I do not bite my thumb at you, sir." And I asked my literature teacher, "What in the world does that mean, that they're biting their thumbs at each other?" And she said, "Well, it'd be like flipping them the bird," right? It's the same concept in this moment. Essentially, these people are biting their thumbs. They're wagging their heads. They're flipping them the bird. They're saying, "We have nothing to do with you." They're showing utter disdain. Then there's the second group of people that show up, and they're found in verse number 31, where it tells us that likewise the chief priests, mocking, said among themselves and the scribes, "He saved others, but he could not save himself." Now, the difference between these people and the first is the first people seemingly were just kind of walking through the area and saw this and decided to participate in this crucifixion of a sovereign. But these people, the chief priests and the scribes, you know by now, they are directly responsible for the events as they're unfolding. It was the religious folks who had conspired together to bring about his death, to put him through a kangaroo court, and had pleaded for his blood. Matthew's gospel has an alarming statement where Pontius Pilate brings Jesus before the crowd, and he says, I can find nothing wrong with him. And the chief priests and the scribes, Matthew tells us, got the people to say in accord, let his blood be upon our heads. They brought their own curse upon themselves. And these were the people who had encouraged such. These were the people who had been more bold, more brazen, had done everything that they could do, pushed everything out of the way to do the unthinkable of killing an innocent man. The first group simply passed by. They ridiculed this one that they were so confident a few days before had said that he could rebuild a temple in 3 days. The religious, however, they were quite different. They mocked him. They spoke amongst each other, almost in celebration. He saved others, but he cannot save himself. I think, beloved, in this moment, they thought that they had actually won. I think they thought in this moment that they were doing the people a favor, that they were showing the people what they should have seen with their own eyes. In other words, I think these religious zealots in this moment thought to themselves, the people will thank us later for what we're doing. You see, in order to understand this, you have to back up and understand their history a little bit. But these people had seen false messiahs raise up. And many times the people had followed these false messiahs in undertaking, trying to overthrow Rome. And time again, thousands of Jews lost their lives. And I think the chief priests looked at the situation and they said, we are not going to allow that to happen again. And so they moved in order to bring about this crucifixion. And I think they did it for one of two reasons. The first is they could have possibly thought to themselves, if this one man dies, he's a false Messiah, we will save thousands of other people in the process, and they will thank us later. They will realize that we were in the right. Or secondly, they might have thought to themselves, because we know they recognized his power, that if he is the real Christ, he will stop this. He will bring himself off the cross. And if he does, then we will believe in him. And then we will know. We will have forced his hand to show what kind of power he had. Whatever the reason was, in this moment, they stand as those religious folks who try to justify the ends, right? They try to justify the ends, the means, by whatever end is brought about. They thought they were doing the right thing. They're like those Southern Baptists who show up late for church, Brother Dimitri, and they sit way back there in the back. They've got an opinion about everything, and they know that if anybody would just listen to them, they would show them that they were right. They even go further in verse 32 and they say, let Christ, the King of Israel, descend now from the cross that we may see and believe. In other words, they were up close and personal to the story. But what they were watching unfold had no profound impact on their understanding or worldview. Then there was a third group, and I mentioned them. They're actually at the beginning of our story. Mark says that on this day, on this Friday, Jesus was nailed between two robbers, one on his right and one on his left. The other Gospels tell us that one of the thieves turned to Jesus and he saw his innocence. That he recognized that what was happening to them was well-deserved, but what was happening to Jesus was not well-deserved. And he pleaded even for mercy. And he said, when you come into your kingdom, I want to go there as well. What a statement, right? And Jesus said to him the words that hopefully all of us would want to hear. When I come into my paradise, when I come into my kingdom, you will be there. But at the end of verse number 32 here in Mark's gospel, Mark tells us that the other thief was reviling him. Those who were crucified with him reviled him. That word revile, it means that he was speaking against him. He was making fun of him. He was drawing a mockery of him. I categorize this fella as dying like a fool. You see, over the years, I've had the opportunity as a pastor of this great church to be with many of your loved ones in those final few moments. And one of the things I've noticed, as people get older and older, they start to listen more, they start to speak less, they start to guard their words more, they contemplate, they think deeply about things. And yet this man, as he's at the end of his life, as he sits at his own funeral, he's not contemplating anything. Perhaps he should have thought about all the people that he'd wronged, all the wrong things he'd done in his life. Perhaps he should have thought about the pain caused through his thievery, whatever the reasons were. But he was still in this moment living life, whatever was left of it, just a few moments with no regret and utter mockery of the one who was just within arm's reach who could save his soul. What makes his death even that much more foolish, crazy as it were, is you know that the painful death of a crucifixion oftentimes resulted in asphyxiation. That is, that they would lose their breath, lose oxygen, lose the capability to breathe, because as their body hung on the cross, the weight of it would sink lower and lower. And so in order to speak, in order to revile, he would have to continually cause himself pain, to raise himself up, to turn to this one and to revile him. How utterly foolish. No contemplation, no thinking about where he stood in this moment, but instead he died as a prideful fool who should have been carrying over his soul, but he was too busy worrying about his neighbor. I kind of want to stop at this moment because I think there's some very real application in these three individuals this morning. Each of these men, they are seen in our culture today. The first is those who are the passerbys, right? Those are the people who are lightly connected to Christ. They're lightly connected to the things of God. They vaguely know what's going on in the local congregation. You know, they show up at those special services because that's what's expected of them. Somewhere along the way, they've been introduced to the words of Jesus, perhaps even his sayings or teachings. But their limited connection to Jesus, well, that means that the cross ultimately means nothing to them. They may sing the songs about how much the cross means. They may celebrate and even wear the jewelry, but in reality, they have no idea what that cross really meant. They have no idea about the penal substitution that Christ died on their behalf. They have no idea what was really experienced as the Father turned his face away so that he who knew no sin would literally become sin on our behalf. In fact, in some cases, it actually has the opposite effect on them to have heard the stories 1,000 times before, because in reality, what they begin to believe is that the story of the cross is exactly that. It's just a story. It's just something to be recited. It's just something that they heard along the way. And in their minds, they struggle with questions like, why would God die? Why didn't he just simply declare forgiveness into existence? And so while they're not vocal or disdaining of others, they pass by the message of cross. They come into church, they shake hands, they live moral lives, they love people, so to speak. They're nice to their neighbor, but they've never really been impacted by the death of Christ because they're unwilling to accept the beauty of the message because the horror of the story seems too much to really comprehend. They're the passerbys. Then there are those religious folks. We got some of them here, right? Hope not, but they're here. I get it. They're part of every church, right? They have no personal relationship. For them, church is about religion. It's about going through the motions. They believe in the law perhaps differently than the priest did, but they think themselves perhaps one day will stand before God, but they will stand on the beauty of their own morality. They think that one day God will come and ask them to give an account for their life, and they'll say, well, I might not have been perfect, but I was better than James Hoagland, right? They'll say to themselves, I may not be really all that good, but I had good intentions most of the time. I may not have been perfect, but I was certainly better than the Baptist preacher. I saw him on the golf course. I heard him call God's name in vain with that treacherous bad 9-iron on the 18th hole, right? There are those religious folks that look to the morality of their lives. And the story of the cross, again, is just a story. It isn't really the power that the Apostle Paul speaks of in 1 Corinthians 1 to belief. They're outwardly maybe a little bit more oppressive than others to any concoction that the cross has real meaning. Sometimes they argue from an intellectual standpoint. They vehemently try to dismember the cross, and instead of embracing it, they're close up and personal to it, but they don't find it beautiful. They find it even sometimes the shame of the Christian message. We talked about a Christian artist a few weeks ago who made the statement that he didn't want to hear any more songs about the death of Christ. I don't know what his heart is. I don't know where his mind was at when he made such a statement, but this is exactly that type of person. The person who says, I can go to church and not necessarily believe that. I can be religious, I can be moral, I can do all the right things, and I don't have to actually believe that what Jesus did on the cross of Calvary was good enough to pay the penalty for my sin. I can live a moral life, and God will be happy with that. And in so doing, even though they may not think that they're doing it, what they're actually doing is openly mocking Jesus, for indeed they cannot comprehend why, if he held such power as the Gospels portray, he did not simply come down from the cross and rescue himself. And then there are those foolishly who die in the manner in which the thief did. At the time of the end of their life, it should be a humbling moment. We've had to deal with death in our family. We've had to deal with death in our church a lot over the last 18 months or so. Surely any normal person would have some regret or at least some thoughts about their own life. They would sit there in those waning moments and contemplate all that had happened, how they might have lived it differently if they'd given a chance or spent more time being honest or at home with their family and their kids. And yet they are the Stalins of the world. Like I referred to a couple of weeks ago in my message, how he, on his deathbed, his daughter said he raised his fist toward heaven as though to say he was going to have one final victory over God. God would have no control over him. And then the part I left out was that after that, she said that he brought his finger down and waved it around the room as though he was pronouncing a curse on everyone there. Namely, he started with a priest who offered prayers for him, as though to say he had seen the afterlife and he was cursing them to experience the same thing. There are those who live among us, beloved, that seemingly have no concern for their morality, no concern for their condition, even no concern for their souls. The idea even of an afterlife runs contrary to their intellectual ability. And so what do? Well, beloved, they run headlong into a devil's hell, almost gleefully. I don't know how any man could trod this road without some comprehension, but so many do. I suppose, beloved, if I could speak from my heart this morning, I fear those people the most. Because the pastor worries, but he thinks to himself, maybe he'll get just enough of a glimpse of the cross that he'll rethink what he's just seen. Maybe he'll hear the message of the cross and his heart's not so hardened. Maybe he'll turn to Christ in that moment. The religious, even though their hearts have become cold and callous toward these things, the pastor thinks to himself, well, maybe enough seeds will get planted that maybe one day it'll finally click for them. But then those who so brazenly dismiss the gospel with no concern, well, they almost seemingly happy to defy it. Those, beloved, I worry about the most because they seem like they're just beyond all hope, don't they? But Mark's gospel tells us about a fourth eyewitness. And I want to spend a few moments on him. Would you allow me that? You say, we don't have any choice. You have the microphone. And all God's people said, amen. Now, before we get to him in verse 39, I do want to point out a couple things that are listed for us about him. First of all, this one we find in verse 39 is directly involved. He is even, let me use this word, responsible for the murder that's taking place. On that Friday, as Jesus hung on the cross, this man, this individual who is nameless, but we're told a few things about him, is directly responsible for the events as they are unfolding. We are told that he is a centurion, a Roman soldier. But not only that he is a centurion, but there in verse 39, we are told that he was also one who stood over and against him. That's the literal translation of the Greek. The ESV says that he stood facing him. That is, that he was directly involved in the execution process. He wasn't somehow a passerby. He wasn't somebody who had paid somebody else to execute. He was directly involved in this moment. He was intimately involved. Now listen to me. If ever there was a man who would not have wanted to see Jesus for all that Jesus claimed to be, it should have been this man. Am I right? If ever there was a man who wanted to believe that Jesus was not God, was not the Messiah, was not the Christ, if ever there was a man who wanted to believe that everything Jesus had said was a lie, a charlatan's trick, it has to be this man. Because if he really believed those things and he killed God, how could he ever understand the reprehensible nature of his soul? How could he ever live knowing an eternal destiny? Think about this. It drove Judas to kill himself. After he turned the Christ over, the guilt so wore on him that he had to kill himself. If ever there was a man who would not want to believe that Jesus was who he had declared he was, it was this man. And so when we get to his statement that he says that Jesus, truly this man was the Son of God, really it's quite remarkable because he is having to fight every temptation. He's having to fight his own counsel, his own will. He's having to fight everything to say this. What a monumental statement. Second, in Mark's gospel, Mark is consumed with showing us the power of Jesus, and that plays a role in what this man says about Jesus. You see, Mark spends his gospel telling endless stories about the miracles. In fact, almost the entire gospel is designated to tell the powerful works of Christ on the earth. In fact, Mark tells more gospel miracles than the other gospel writers because he is consumed with how powerful Jesus was. What's interesting about that, however, is unlike in the other Gospels, every time Mark tells us that Jesus did something powerful, miraculous, wonderful, what's interesting is in the other Gospels, those miracles led men and women to say, hey, this is the Son of God. But in Mark's Gospel, nobody ever says that. Jesus calms the waters and the people are like, well, that's amazing. Could you make us some bread? Right? Jesus feeds 5,000 and they're like, that's pretty impressive, but my wife can do that on short notice, right? They're never really consumed by the power found in his hands. In fact, this phrase, the Son of God, it appears 4 times in Mark's gospel. The first time it appears is in Mark chapter 1, where Mark writes, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. In other words, Mark lays out his gospel by saying, the reason I'm writing to you is to prove to you that Jesus is the Son of God. And he does so by showing us the miracles, the power that he possessed. The next time that this phrase, Son of God, appears, happens in Mark chapter 3 and verse number 11, when demons call him the Son of God. It happens again in Mark chapter 5 and verse 7 when another demon calls him the Son of God. But no person ever seen a miracle, ever seen the power, refers to Jesus as the Son of God until we finally get to our chapter and verse, Mark 15, verse 39. He's there at his death. He's being crucified. He's not doing the powerful. He's not doing the miraculous, so to speak. He's not bringing himself down off the cross. He's not caving into the whims of the people. Instead, he is willingly giving up his soul. And in that moment, for the first time in Mark's gospel, a human being looks up and goes, wait a second, this is not an ordinary man. This truly must be the Son of God. Fascinating. Fascinating. It was not in the miracles. It was not in the power. It was in his death that this, for the first time in Mark's gospel, a human being goes, now I see him for who he is. You say, what's the point? Well, it's pretty simple this morning. Beloved, the cross changed everything for that man that day. Changed everything. He went from one who was directly involved in the execution of an innocent man to the first witness in Mark's gospel to the true nature of who Christ was. Beloved, he is the fruit that every pastor wants to harvest at the telling of the message of the cross. We know that when we tell of Jesus' crucifixion, there will be those who shake their heads. There will be those who ridicule. There will be those who die as a fool, unwilling to humble themselves even in death. But we hope, beloved, we beg by God's sovereign grace, that there would be those who watch the events unfold in their mind's eye and come to the realization that surely Jesus was more than a man. He was the Son of God. As ridiculous as it sounds this morning, as unfathomable as the story is, we hope that the preaching of the gospel, preaching of the cross, changes the perception of those who watch. This man's life was eternally changed by what he saw on that day. My admonition then to you this morning would be quite simple. When you look at the cross, what do you see? When you look at the cross through your mind's eye Is the cross a stumbling block, as the Apostle Paul spoke in 1 Corinthians 1? Is it a story just told in church, maybe once a year, but has no reality in your heart? Is it something you simply shake your head at, having not been able to understand? Or perhaps you're more violent in your protest, and you've been drug here this morning kicking and screaming. With all that I am, I would plead with you to see the cross of Jesus as the way that the centurion saw it. As the transgressions, my transgressions, your transgressions were paid in full, and come to the realization that truly this is the Son of God forevermore. What do you see when you see the cross? I want to draw one final conclusion this morning because it is Easter morning. And I want you to pick up your text and follow along with me. At the end of Mark's Gospel, you have one more chapter after this centurion statement. Chapter number 16. And if you read down to verse number 9, right before verse number 9, there's a statement there. It says in italics, some of the earliest manuscripts do not include 16 verses 9 through 20. And at the risk of opening a big can of worms, I would offer you, schedule an appointment in my office and I'll explain what I'm about to say more fully. But most scholars don't believe that verses 9 through 20 were actually a part of Mark's original gospel. We believe somebody added them later on. And so really Mark's gospel comes to its end, we believe, in verse number 8 of chapter 16. And you say, why is that remarkable? Well, the reason it's remarkable is because it's not the full drawn out resurrection story we see in the other gospels. Instead, in Mark's gospel, you get this picture drawn. And that is that Jesus Christ is crucified on the cross of Calvary. People are making fun of it. They're drawing images about it. They're ridiculing it. They're reviling it. Even a thief who's dying with him is reviling it. And suddenly a centurion Roman soldier pops up and he says, truly this is the Son of God. This was the Son of God. And the next event that essentially unfolds, he's buried in a tomb, and the Marys come, chapter 16, the next morning to meet him, only they arrive at the tomb to find it empty. And as my Greek professor said when I was in college, he said, it's almost an ending like, what just happened? We don't know. How did the story unfold? Now, obviously, these women encounter a man clothed in white, as bright as lightning, and he says, why are you searching for the living among the dead? He's not here. Just like he said, he is risen, right? But what's interesting is Mark brings his gospel account to an end by very vaguely referring to the resurrection. You say, why is that interesting? Go back with me to the Passion of Christ, Mel Gibson's movie. When it ended, do you remember how it ended? No lines. They just showed an empty tomb, a stone rolled away and a light shone forth. And I remember walking out and Kelly said to me, it seems like they could have done more about the end. Right? But Mark is not consumed with the end. The end is important, yes. Because it is the seal, it is the sign that indeed he conquered death, hell, and the grave and will live eternally with him. Yes, it's important. Yes, it's the seal of that redemption, so to speak. Yes, it's the promise we hold on to. But for Mark, it was how you viewed that death on the cross that was so fundamental. When you looked at Christ crucified, yes, celebrate the resurrection, but until you saw him crucified as the substitution for your sin, then the rest of it didn't really matter. Such a powerful moment in Mark's gospel. And so I say to you again, what do you see when you see Christ crucified? Are you a passerby? Are you a religious? Are you openly obstinate? Or are you like a Roman centurion and you say, I might have been directly responsible for this, but truly, this was the Son of God.